In this episode, I'm taking the Bigster to its least favorite road type, the highway. And honestly, mine too. Let's see what actually happens. How about this as a YouTube video title? Dacia Bigster Hybrid, fuel consumption on highway 2.5 liters per 100 kilometers. Better fuel consumption compared to a diesel at 30 kilometers per hour. Well, the rest of 100 kilometers is a small margin we can ignore. This is what happens when I get bored on the highway during a heavy traffic stretch. I had just reset the trip computer for the 120 kilometers per hour section when heavy traffic started, lasting for about 40 kilometers just after passing Budapest. That section is slightly downhill, which also helped. Under those conditions, the consumption dropped to 1.5 liters per 100 kilometers at one point. Obviously, this is not representative of real highway fuel consumption for this hybrid, but it does show very clear what happens in these conditions, both with me and the car. No one expects miracles from a hybrid on the highway, and I don't either. I know exactly why I bought this car for, and the highway is not the reason. Usually, I avoid highways when I can. As I said before, for me it's boring. There is not much to see, and you lose the freedom to stop whenever you want. And more importantly, in some countries it costs more, sometimes significantly more compared to national roads. My lifestyle actually allows me to avoid highways most of the times, like in episode 12, when I drove all the way to Italy and back, mostly on national roads. But this time I'm doing the opposite. I will drive almost entirely on highways, and I want to measure something very specific: fuel consumption and costs at 4 constant speeds: 100, 110, 120, and 130 kilometers per hour. We'll include the highway toll as well for each country. For this test, I wanted conditions that are as real as possible. Not perfect, just realistic. The route was almost entirely highway, crossing only Hungary and Slovenia on the way to Italy and back. On the outbound trip, I started early in the morning at around 6:40, with temperatures close to 0 degrees Celsius. By midday, temperatures increased to around 20 degrees, and when I reached Italy, it was about 22 degrees. On the return trip, conditions were warmer from the start, around 13 degrees in the morning, going up to 25-26 degrees during the day. Traffic conditions were generally moderate, but not perfect. After passing Budapest on the outbound trip, I had around 40 kilometers of heavy traffic, and that I mentioned previously. I faced the same traffic on the same section on the return trip as well. There were also several roadworks sections in both Hungary and Italy, limiting the speed in certain areas. The rest of the route allowed long constant speed driving, which is ideal for this kind of test. But overall, this was not a controlled environment, this was real-world driving. And that matters, because temperature, traffic, and road conditions all influence fuel consumption. One small observation: the ODB device shows a speed that is about 4 to 5 kilometers per hour lower than what the car's display shows. From what I have seen, the car speeds seems to be more accurate, as it usually matches the speed cameras and the roadside displays. So I still need to see if I can configure the OBD properly. Now let's see the numbers. I only had one section where the speed limit was 100 kilometers per hour, or 60 miles per hour. This was before reaching Budapest. In total, I drove around 200 kilometers like this, using a little over 10 liters of fuel. On screen, you can see the average consumption, price per liter, and the total cost for this section. For most of the time, I was able to keep a constant speed of 100 kilometers per hour. However, for about 7 kilometers, I had to leave the highway due to roadworks. As I got closer to Budapest, traffic also became more intense, so I had to either slow down or speed up slightly to overtake. Overall, normal highway conditions. Nothing unusual in terms of engine behavior or hybrid battery temperatures. Looking at the altitude, there was a slight uphill trend, but nothing significant. At this speed, the car managed to drive in EV mode for about 35% of the distance. Here you can see a graphical overview of the same data. Color represents speed. Red is close to 100 kilometers, yellow is around 50, and green is below 20. You can clearly see the section where I left the highway. The altitude graph shows a gradual increase towards Budapest, but again, nothing major. The fuel consumption graph reflects the lower speed during that detour, and a slight increase when climbing at the end of the section. The speed graph confirms that I maintain 100 km per hour most of the time. And finally, here are some additional details. RPM, engine coolant temperature, outside temperature, and hybrid battery temperature. Next, I had two sections where the speed limit was 110 km per hour or 68 miles per hour. As expected, fuel consumption increased slightly compared to the previous sections. Nothing surprising here. In total, I drove just under 220 kilometers with a total cost of a little under 20 euros. The altitude changes were not significant. Engine RPM, temperatures, and hybrid battery values all look normal. One visible difference is the EV driving share. At this speed, the car managed around 30% EV mode, slightly lower than the previous section. Looking at the speed graph, you can see a few slowdowns caused by traffic and roadworks. These interruptions are also visible in the other graphs, and they do have an impact both on engine behavior and battery temperature. In the second 110 km per hour section, there were fewer interruptions, which helps explain the slightly higher fuel consumption. Next, I had two sections of 120 km per hour, covering a total of around 315 km or about 196 miles. As expected, fuel consumption increased again, but nothing dramatically. One important detail, the first section had heavier traffic, especially just after passing Budapest, the one I initially mentioned, and that had an impact on the final numbers. The total cost for these sections was a little over 31 euros. The slightly higher outside temperature led to a small increase in battery temperature, but everything stayed well within the optimal operating range. The altitude profile shows mostly flat terrain, with no major changes. EV mode decreased again, but not significantly, covering around 28% of the distance. The graphs confirm what we saw on the road. The first section shows more interruption mainly due to the traffic, while the second one is much more linear and consistent. Finally, the 130 km per hour sections. These had the biggest share of the trip, around 600 kilometers or about 370 miles. This required roughly 40 liters of fuel at a total cost of around 70 euros. At this speed, the fuel consumption increases significantly, ranging between 6.7 and 7 liters per 100 kilometers. The engine stays mostly at around 2700 RPMs, and the engine temperature remains stable, never going above 82 degrees Celsius. Even with outside temperature reaching 27 degrees, the battery stayed below 35 degrees, which is well within a safe range. As expected, the hybrid system contributed less at this speed. Full EV driving covered only around 15 to 18% of the distance. The graph shows a few interruptions, including stops and lower speeds caused by roadworks. Instant fuel consumption sits around 8.5 to 9 liters per 100 kilometers. But thanks to the hybrid system, the average is reduced. The difference between 120 and 130 kilometers per hour is the most significant one in this trip. And that leads to a simple conclusion. Driving at 120 kilometers per hour seems to be the better balance between speed and efficiency, at least to me, when I'll drive on the highway in the future. As a bonus, I also had two sections with mixed speed limits, where I simply followed the road signs. This part of the trip was in Slovenia, and it also had the most significant altitude change of the entire route. Speed limits varied naturally between 100 and 130 km per hour, and I respected them throughout. In total, these sections covered around 400 kilometers or about 250 miles. It requires roughly 22 liters of fuel at a cost of around 38 euros. In terms of temperatures, everything stayed within normal limits. The only exception was the engine coolant, which briefly reached 84 degrees. Looking at the speed distribution on the outbound trip, you can see a higher percentage of driving at 130 kilometers per hour. And that explains the slightly higher fuel consumption. On the return trip, the distribution was more balanced across the different speed limits. The graphs gives a clear picture of the altitude changes in both cases. And the speed graph shows a more dynamic driving pattern with frequent ups and downs and a few stops along the way. Now looking at the entire outbound trip, these are the final numbers. Total distance and total time, along with average fuel consumption, total fuel used and total cost, calculated based on the price for each fill-up. Overall, EV mode covered around 25% of the total distance. Looking at the speed distribution, you can see a clear tendency to drive mostly in two main speed ranges. And finally, the graphs support all of this data: fuel level, altitude profile, speed variations, RPM and temperatures. Together, they give a complete picture of how the car performed on this trip. Looking at the return trip, the overall results are very similar. There are some small differences in fuel consumption, cost, and speed distribution. One important note: this report is still generated using an unstable version of the app, so some of the calculation may not be perfectly accurate. But even with that, this gives a clear idea of how the car behaves. Now comparing this trip with the one from episode 12. Same destination, but using national roads. There is a distance difference of almost 300 kilometers, or about 185 miles. The main reason is the different starting point, but in terms of time, the difference is much bigger. The national road trip took almost double the time. So no surprise the highway is clearly more efficient when it comes to time. Looking at fuel consumption, the difference is around 21 liters, even with the extra 300 kilometers on the national road trip. That means better fuel economy, more EV usage, and lower fuel cost on national roads. When calculating the total cost difference, including tolls and the highway trip and the 25 euro hostel, the gap is around 92 euros. If I adjust the national road trip to match the same distance, that would add roughly another 25 euros in savings. So in the future, I will need to repeat both routes between Romania and Italy. Personally, I still prefer national roads. I can change the route, enjoy different views, and have more freedom. Even if I use some of the savings for accommodation, I still enjoy the trip more. Overall, the car behaves well on the highway. Wind noise is not higher than most cars on the road today, so it's actually fine. I didn't feel disturbed by it. The engine noise is even less noticeable and mostly covered by the wind at higher speeds. But this is something I want to improve anyway. I'm planning to add extra sound insulation and test the difference. I recently bought a device to measure noise levels, so I'll do a dedicated episode where I test noise inside the cabin in different conditions and at different speeds. One important thing I noticed on the trip is how much physical condition matters. On the outbound trip, I only had around 3 hours of sleep the night before, so I was very tired, and I did feel more back pain right here compared to my previous endurance test. So on the return trip, I only had around 6 hours of broken sleep the night before. Not a great night, waking up frequently. I started to feel some back pain, uncomfortable enough to notice. Then somewhere around the midpoint of the trip, I started adjusting the seat. Just small changes, just experimenting. And about 2 hours later, the pain actually had almost completely disappeared. So I felt noticeably more relaxed, which is actually right now the moment I record. So the car can be comfortable enough, but just pay attention to the physical condition and seat adjustment before a long trip. This is something that is worth keeping in mind. Now regarding the fuel consumption. Yes, you can drive this car on the highway, but it really depends on your expectations. If you regularly drive at 120 or 130 kilometers per hour, this hybrid system is probably not the best fit. But if you are more relaxed and you drive at around 100 or 110 kilometers per hour, then this car can return a decent average consumption. One more important thing, saying that a diesel is better than a hybrid car or the other way around, is actually not really correct, nor fair to say, because a car should not be judged based on a single use case. Every car has strengths and limitations, and in the end, it all depends on how you actually use it. People should choose their cars based on their actually and real needs, not based on one scenario, like for example, fuel consumption on the highway. And this is something actually I want to explore more in the future, because it's actually directly related to the platform I'm building. I'll make anyway a dedicated episode about this. So this episode is not about changing anyone's mind, and I don't think it's revealing anything new basically. Instead, it confirms that with a hybrid system, you get better fuel consumption at lower speeds. So this episode is actually simply about showing how this car, the Bigster, behaves in real highway conditions at different speeds. No perfect laboratory conditions. And from there, anyone can decide if a hybrid like this fits their needs or not. In the end, I want to thank to the 9 members supporting this project. Your consistent support is really helping this project grow and move step by step forward, becoming a full-time project. And of course, thank you to everyone watching, liking and commenting to any of these episodes. Again, I always recommend checking the comments as well, because many of you share real experience, useful data, and sometimes even better insights than what I can include in the video. So it's definitely worth going through them. Now I have a question for you. What speed do you usually drive on the highway and why? Let me know in the comments. In the next episode, I'm heading to Bystrica, the next county capital on my list. Until the next episode, drive safe and wish you all the best.